The design, the fine-tuning, there's just abundant scientific evidence pointing to that.
That God is the creator of the heavens and the earth, but at the same time, He is a loving God who gives us free will.
I'm forgetting that I'm the host and I'm just gleaning everything from the two of you. Blessed day to all our amazing viewers. My name is Pastor Priya Anthony, and I have the amazing privilege and opportunity of speaking to these gentlemen from Reasons to Believe. So on my left, I've got Dr. Jeff Zweerink, and on my right, I've got Dr. Balajied Nongrum. How are you, sirs?
Doing very well today.
Thank you for having us.
So the first question, viewers, today is, how do you see the relevance of nature and scripture in understanding the truthfulness of Christianity?
Looking at that important question,
Yes.
we need to keep in mind that at the heart of the Christian faith
Yes.
is the idea of the pursuit of truth. And in the pursuit of truth, as one scholar said, that all truth is ultimately God's truth. And so the Christian tradition also have this in their understanding, historically speaking, that God has revealed Himself in two important medium. One of the important medium that God has revealed Himself is through the scripture that we all believe. And so the Bible is that revelation that God has revealed Himself, and through it we get to know the mind of God and the will that He has. But then more importantly, that very often people don't think about is the fact that God has not only revealed Himself through the scripture, that is the Bible, but God has also revealed Himself in nature, that is the universe as a whole. You know, when you go to Psalm 19, the Bible tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God. So when you look at the nature as a whole, when you look at the universe as a whole, it tells a story. And that is where, when you go through science as an academic discipline, it is actually the observation of the universe, and through the observation, it makes necessary interpretation. So from a Christian tradition, we have both the scripture, that is God's revelation, special revelation to humankind, and then you have general revelation that is revealed through nature. So as a result of both of these two important books that we say, figuratively speaking, we believe that if God is the author of both nature and scripture, then they ought not to conflict, as many a times people tend to think that nature and scripture, religion and science, they contradict each other, but they don't.
No.
From a Christian tradition, nature is one book, scripture is another book. And if God is the author, then there ought not to be any contradiction. But then, hold on for a second. Where then is the conflict that very often people tend to think that there is? It is in the interpretation of both these two books, nature and scripture. So when you study nature, it becomes science. When you study the scripture, it becomes theology. So sometimes there may be some contradiction between theology and science. That is why we need to follow the correct interpretation. So when people use false way of interpreting, then it may result in a wrong understanding. So therefore, in the ultimate process or in the ultimate analysis, we believe from a Christian perspective that there is no conflict between nature, which is one book, and scripture, which is another book given to us by God. And that is the position that we hold, that in our pursuit of truth, ultimately, we need to actually consider both of these important books. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much for that. And so now we're going to our second speaker, Dr. Jeff Zweerink.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoying our conversation here today.
Yeah, amazing. So I've got one question for you, and we will go back again to Dr. Bala and we'll do likewise. So the first question I have for you is, are science and religion friends or enemies? Or in other words, why do people think that Christianity and science are enemies?
I think that's a great question, Pastor Priya. And what's interesting is that when you look at a little bit of the history, you know, as Dr. Balajied was commenting, we see that from a Christian perspective, we expect what God's revealed in science, what God's revealed in creation. We expect them to line up. God's revealed in creation, what God's revealed in Scripture. But there is a very prominent idea, especially in the West, and I imagine probably around the world, that when you really do science and when you really look at Scripture, they just disagree and they're in conflict. And that really traces back to a couple of historical events that have been misunderstood. One, when Galileo was starting to interact with the church about whether the earth orbited around the sun or not, that whole scenario has been portrayed as, you know, the church was just dogmatic and said, this is what Scripture says, and Galileo's looking at the universe, and this is what science says. And in reality, it was a far more complicated thing. That the real conflict there actually lay in who got to interpret the Bible. Galileo, as a layman, was saying that, when in reality, that's not the case. Now, there's another component to that happened not too long after, where as Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, the church is perceived as being against the advances of science and sticking to Scripture. And so there's this mix. People have taken that idea, and there were two historians back in the late 1800s that said, you know what, Christianity and science are actually in conflict with one another. And as science advances, Christianity is going to have to recede. And that was John Draper and Andrew White published these ideas. And that idea is still prevalent in the popular world. What's interesting is, from an academic perspective, that whole idea of them being in conflict, it's been shown to be just wrong, because Christianity and science far more often than not operate in harmony with one another. Sometimes they just kind of operate alongside one another. Occasionally they'll conflict, but at the end of the day, the findings of science that we see, the study of Scripture, as Dr. Balajied has commented, when we properly interpret them, they line up very, very well. And in fact, the study of science actually gives us great confidence that what Scripture says is true, and who God says He is actually the God we want to worship.
And that goes to my second question for you, Dr. Bala. Does modern science repudiate miracles when we read Scripture?
That's a very good question, Pastor Priya, because in the mind of many who are students of science would actually come up with this question that when you think of the miracles that takes place, because we believe that if there is a God and there are miracles that God performs in this universe, and then what happens is people tend to think that it is in conflict with what? With science. As one thinker by the name of David Hume, he once mentioned that miracles are a violation of the natural laws. But you see, the problem is this, that very often people who have been influenced by this kind of philosophy tend to think that we live in a closed universe, a universe that functions by the law of causality or cause and effect, and so nothing else functions. But then there is a problem to that. You see, in other words, I tend to think that it is the physical laws that are there, or the natural laws, that tell us that there is a miracle that has happened. Now, let me give an example. An example, I think of my son who likes apples. And so my wife would actually tell him, you can't just eat apples all day long. So she has allocated that 1 apple per day. So she would actually keep in a basket 7 apples per week with 1 apple per day. But then, before even the week is done, the apples from the basket is already over. And so when my wife comes and she counts 1, 2, 3 till 7 and tells my son that there were 7 apples in the basket, and how come now, before the week is over, you have already eaten all the apples? Now, so when we talk about that, you see, we don't say that when the 7 apples kept in the basket is already over, we don't say that the laws of mathematics has broken down. We don't say that. But what we are saying is that there is an agency that was involved. So basically, we know mathematics. We know that there were 7 apples, 1 per day, but all the 7 apples in the basket that was meant to be eaten throughout the entire 7 days, it is over. So mathematics tells us that something else has happened. And so we know that the agency here is who? My son. My son is the culprit who has eaten more than what is allocated. Similarly, when you look at religion, when you look at Christianity, the mother of all miracles is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We all know when people die, they don't rise again. And that is the natural law. But here what we are saying, that in Christianity we believe that this universe is not a closed system. It is an open system. And if it is an open system, there is also the possibility of an agency, that is God, who is in the equation, who can bring about a miracle. And so when Jesus was crucified on the cross, we believe that God, in his sovereign will and power, has raised Jesus from the dead. And that is an agency that has taken place. So there is no conflict whatsoever. So miracle does not violate the natural law, but it is the natural law, the existence of the natural law, that helps us understand miracle in its proper context. And that is why I tend to actually think that in an open system, as Christianity would say, not a closed system, but an open system, the law of causality can best help us understand the miracles that we see, that God performs in our day-to-day life, which is not a violation, as David Hume would say, about the natural law, but it is the intervention of a miracle of an agency that actually takes place. And that, to me, Pastor Priya, is the best way of how I understand that it does not violate in a Christian context.
Yeah, fabulous. I love the analogy of the apples. So brilliant. Thank you so much. Right, Dr. Jeff, second question for you today. And I'm waiting for the answer. What are some surprising discoveries that the Bible describes?
That's a really interesting question because, again, a lot of people think, okay, the Bible, that's just about kind of how to relate to God. The idea that it actually would tell us how the world works. Just straight out of the gate, when you look at the introduction to Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. From a scriptural perspective, you've got this idea that God is creating. He's bringing something new into existence.
Yes.
And what is it that he's bringing into existence? The heaven, the earth. That's all that there is, the space, the time, the matter, and the energy. Now, if you go back to the start of the 1900s, basically all scientists thought the universe was eternal. That space and time, this stuff that we know is there, but it's just always there. It's been there forever, always will be there forever, has no bound to it. When Einstein was looking at what we knew about how the world worked, he saw this weird feature that I'm not going to go too much into, but it turns out that when you looked at things from a Newton perspective, how things moved, and when you look at things from a James Clerk Maxwell perspective of how electricity works, the laws of physics looked different depending on how you moved. And he said, wait a second, that's not right. So he said, all right, what would it take if I developed a model where the laws of physics were the same regardless of how the observer was moving? And when he did that, we now get special and general relativity. Now, the implications of general relativity when you apply it to the universe is that the universe is dynamic. It's either expanding or contracting. And about 15 years after he proposed his theory of general relativity, we find out that the universe is expanding. Well, if the universe is expanding and general relativity is true, that points to there being a beginning. The Bible said that all along. Now, another surprising thing, you shift away from that, go right after Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now you've got, and the earth was formless and void. Darkness was on the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Describing the conditions of the early earth there. So we're witnessing things from the surface of the earth. What does the early earth look like? Well, as we've started to discover planets and be able to simulate how do planets form, we recognize that how planets form as they come together, the last stages, are going to make this very dense atmosphere surrounding a planet. Water, you might be surprised to know, is the third most abundant molecule in the universe. So these planets are going to have water on them. The description we see in Genesis 1:2 of the early Earth is exactly what we see when we look at the scientific record. And as we now look at the creation events throughout Genesis 1 and into Genesis 2, the order and the nature of those creation miracles, they line up with what we know scientifically. And it even goes so far as this. When you look at Scripture and ask, what does it say about who God is and who we are? One of the things that is true is that God is a one God in three persons, that he is inherently relational.
Yes.
Now, we ask the question, we're made in God's image. What does that mean for us? That means we're inherently relational.
Yes.
It turns out there are a lot of scientific studies that show that if you want to be healthy, a key component of being healthy is having good relationships. In fact, bad relationships are as dangerous as alcoholism and smoking. So when we look at what Scripture says, it gives such a great description of the way the universe works, how the earth works, the design, the fine-tuning. There's just abundant scientific evidence pointing to that. And so we find there's a lot of neat things that when we look at what Scripture says, it lines up with what we see in creation.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. I'm forgetting that I'm the host and I'm just gleaning everything from the two of you.
It's a lot of fun, isn't it?
It is absolutely. All right. So we're going to our third question, Dr. Bala. How do you engage with the questions on evil and suffering? How can a loving God allow evil and suffering in our lives?
Thank you. That's a very good question, Pastor Priya. It is a question that nobody will not have. In fact, everywhere I have spoken, in different forums, that is the one question that will inevitably be raised in any audience, no matter what topic. The question is, especially this, that people tend to struggle. How can there be a loving God? And yet, on the other hand, there can be so much of suffering, because a loving God will not allow his subjects or his creation to go through suffering. But you see, the problem is this, that many a times people do not understand that, you see, when you look from a Christian perspective, this problem can easily be resolved. Why? Because we believe that God is the creator of the heavens and the earth, but at the same time, he is a loving God, a loving God who gives us free will to think and to also do what we are not robots in another sense. But then, technically speaking, you have two kinds of evil that we need to keep in mind. One is the moral evil that I have said, that free agents like human beings can do what they will. Right? And they can bring harm and cause harm in the society. And that is what we actually talk about, moral evil. Moral evil out of the free will that we have. But on the other hand, there is also the physical evil. Physical evil such as, let's say, a tsunami or a tornado that can come about, or an earthquake for that matter, where there can be a loss of life to so many people. And that is what they call physical evil. But let me focus on the moral evil. You see, from a biblical point of view, it is easily resolved that there is a loving God, and if there are evil that we see, and how did God deal with this? God has dealt with this problem of evil, because when you look at the cross of Jesus, we say that the cross of Jesus is an answer to the problem of evil. When people ask, where is God in the midst of evil and suffering? I easily point them to the cross. Why? Because the cross of Christ is the solution to the problem that we all go through. Yes, personal evil, I go through. We all go through. You may have gone through. But keep in mind that the ultimate problem of evil has been dealt with by the person of Christ on the cross. But there is another important aspect that we need to keep in mind. Why did God keep or allow evil and suffering to be there in this entire grand design? Now, allow me, Pastor, to unpack this. There is a book that is written by Dr. Paul Brand, and the title of the book is The Gift of Pain. And he says in the subtitle that this is the one gift that we all need, but nobody wants it. Why? Because he says he was doing a research work among leprosy patients. And leprosy patients, people tend to have this one problem where they are unable to sense pain. And so here, a leprosy patient will go through life, and they may go through an injury or an accident where they may have a fracture of the hand or a leg, but they will not feel pain. They cannot feel pain. Now, if you have the sensitivity of pain, if you have fracture, you will definitely feel pain. But for leprosy people, for leprosy patients, they do not feel pain. They can't sense pain. And that is why here, Dr. Paul Brand, as he was researching, he was trying to see as to how he can bring about, he can restore back the gift of pain. And that is what every person prays, especially those who go through leprosy. Their only prayer is, God, give us back, restore unto us again the gift of pain. This is one important aspect that it has spoken to me, that God perhaps has given us, all of us, the gift of pain that we can sense, because it can be an alarm to an danger that is ahead. So we know, we live in a world where nobody wants to talk about suffering. Nobody wants to talk about pain. But God has a purpose in allowing pain to be a fabric of the design of this cosmos as a whole. Why? Because it is when we sense pain, we can sense danger, we can take care of ourselves. That's another important thing that I want to leave with the audience to think about the problem of evil and suffering in light of a God who's loving.
Wow, you did well. Thank you so much. All right, Dr. Jeff, last question for you for this session. Would the discovery of extraterrestrial life disprove the Bible?
When I first thought about this very question about 10, 15 years ago, my thought was, yeah, it might, because it seems like, if God's created everything and he talks only about human life, if we found life somewhere else, that would be a problem. And so this is what I love about being involved in the science and Christianity discussion, is that I get to go look, what does Christianity actually say? What does the science actually say? And one of the fascinating things is that we have found thousands of planets outside our solar system. That's a new thing that we've discovered in the last 20 or 30 years. And we found that our universe generates carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, the things that life requires. Our universe seems designed to produce. And so it does raise this question, might there be life out there? It's a very real possibility that science might find that there's life out there. And, kind of the way it's often articulated is, imagine you're sitting out, at least in the US, you're sitting on the White House lawn, aliens come down, land on the lawn, all of the world religions are just going to be shown that they're incorrect. And I'm like, oh, what do I do with that? And so, all right, let's go in and dig into that. What I've come to appreciate that I didn't understand at the time was that Christians have thought about this for millennia. This is not a new discussion to Christians. In fact, science is the latecomer to the game, if you will. And kind of the central issues it plays out are, you look at the grand narrative of Christianity, that God creates the world. This place puts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve rebel. So there's the creation, there's the fall, there's the redemption as Christ comes to redeem, and then there's the consummation where we live in the eternal state. And so just looking at that in terms of that, it's like, okay, if there's other life out there, God's still the creator.
Yes.
But now we've got this question, are they fallen? Do they need redemption? And this is what surprised me, is that you go back at least 1,000 years ago, and Christians have been thinking about, well, okay, so if God created other life somewhere else, did they fall? Well, if they didn't fall, then they don't need redemption. And so what Scripture reveals about creation is still a good description. It's just focused on what happened here, because that's mainly what we need to know. Maybe they did fall, and there's some other means of redemption God has. So what the point is not that I'm going to walk through all of those, but Christians have thought about this. And if we find life out there, it still fits very comfortably. It fits very well within what God's revealed in Scripture. As I have a chance to engage that question and think about it, what I realize is that it's a great opportunity to understand the theology. It helps me understand more deeply who God made me and how do I relate to him. One last little point about this is that, again, Christians have been thinking about this for a long time. So we go back a little bit in history. You've got two very prominent scientists. There's Galileo. We know who Galileo is. Kepler, who did a lot of work on planetary orbit. Both devout Christians. Galileo thought God only created life here on Earth. Kepler thought God created life throughout the universe. So this question of does life exist out there, I think it's a fascinating scientific question, but it's also a fascinating theological question. And one that as we dig into it, we really do see how big and awesome and powerful and how loving God is and the relationship he invites us into through Christ.
Thank you everyone for watching. Stay tuned in.